Good morning and or afternoon to everyone today. I'd like to thank everybody for joining today's National Weather Association Webinar Wednesday. I'm super excited about today's topic. We're going to doing a kind of a review of the 2018 hurricane season and a sneak preview of what we might expect for the 2019 hurricane season. So I'm really excited about this. I'm looking forward to talking about it. Let me introduce myself. My name is Tim Bryce. I'm a meteorologist with the National Weather Service in El Paso, Texas. And joining me also on the call is another member of the webinar, the National Weather Association webinar team is Miss Rebecca Mazer. She's up in the NWS Alaska region at the Arctic Test Bed up there. How are you doing, Miss Rebecca?
I'm doing well. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Very good. Also joining us on our panel, our esteemed panel, I should say. We've got here Tom Johnstone. He's the MIC in Tallahassee. How are you doing today, Tom?
Doing great, thank you.
Very good. And then also joining us on the call is Miss Rebecca Moulton. She's a meteorologist out of FEMA Region 4. Miss Rebecca, where's FEMA Region 4 headquartered out of? Oh, you're still muted. Oh, all right, we'll come back.
We might have lost her.
Sure. Also joining us is Dr. Jerry Bell, who is the lead seasonal forecaster for NOAA's CPC. How are you doing, Dr. Jerry?
Good morning. Doing good.
Very good. Finally, last but of course not least, is let's see, Chris Gilson. He's with Spectrum News out of Orlando, Florida. How are you?
Good morning. I'm good.
You know, I was talking to Chris earlier, and I was telling him, I said, whenever I hear somebody who lives in Orlando, I just picture them every weekend going over to Disney World and having a great time over there. But I'm really looking forward to our discussion today. We're going to cover a lot of topics about the hurricane season, messaging that went out during last year's hurricane season, some of the impacts. Also, like I mentioned, we're going to talk about what's going to happen or what we're forecasting to happen looking into 2019. So I'm looking forward to that. Just some notes here real quickly. If you would like to ask any of our panelists a question about either former hurricane season or the upcoming one, you can use the hashtag there on Twitter at hashtag NWA WebWed. WEBWED. I always have to be careful. I get my B's and my D's confused there. So NWA WebWed is the hashtag. We'll be live tweeting those out. Miss Hannah Strong is happily in the background tweeting away some of the slides and pictures of these for the presentations. But go ahead and tweet out any of your questions. We'd be happy to answer them. Miss Rebecca up in Alaska, I should say, since we have two Rebeccas. Who are we going to start out with first today?
We are going to start with Mr. Tom Johnstone.
All right, Mr. Tom, so you were there kind of in ground zero for Hurricane Michael. I imagine that's what you're going to kind of focus on, but go ahead and just start talking and we'll get your slides up on the screen here.
Yeah, my name is Tom Johnson. I'm the meteorologist in charge here in Tallahassee. I arrived in Tallahassee 6 weeks to the day before the landfall of Hurricane Michael, so I was still in temporary quarters when it struck. So it was very soon after my arrival here. I had worked at the Corpus Christi office before Tallahassee, so I took the landfall of Hurricane Harvey there. And a lot of similarities between the two storms, especially as it applies to rapid intensification. Harvey just ran out of water and came in extremely strong in Rockport. Michael had a little more time over water, and as we know, got all the way down to 919 millibars and did reach Category 5 strength. It's a reminder, I think, and it's something that we talked about at the National Hurricane Conference in New Orleans. There's been now 4 Category 5 hurricanes to strike the continental United States historically, and none of them was a hurricane 72 hours before landfall, tropical storm or less. So what we've been telling our partners, and we were up at the state of Alabama Emergency Operations Center yesterday talking about this, is if you're struck by a Category 5 hurricane that was a hurricane 120 hours out, it will be the first time. So I think plans need to be considered that have this 72-hour tropical storm to Category 5 hurricane, because Camille, the Labor Day storm, Andrew, and Michael, all horrible storms, we're basically little to nothing 72 hours out. So when I open with that, I think, for me, the similarities between Harvey and Michael, most striking were the rapid intensification. And that rapid intensification really puts a humongous stress on internal operations and our partners, as all of our timelines have to be accelerated and squeezed in. You can go to the next slide.
Okay, here, I didn't have them up, so here we go. All right.
I want to acknowledge getting through Michael required a Herculean effort by not just this office, but our whole region, the agency, and some of our core partners in NOAA as well. I had actually flown out of town on the Friday before Michael made landfall, and went back to Corpus Christi, where my wife and daughter still were. And by the late afternoon on Friday, after I got home, I had already booked a plane ticket to come back. Things blew up that quickly. So I came back that weekend, still expecting a lower end hurricane midweek, but things escalated so quickly. One of the early decisions we made that I think was tremendously helpful for our partners and for the response was deploying meteorologists out to Panama City, here in Tallahassee, and to Florida State, which also has a campus in Panama City. And to do that required a massive logistical effort, coordinating backfilling positions, and then after the storm, getting survey help in. So I want to acknowledge folks in Atlanta, in Fort Worth, in Houston, in Miami, in Mobile, both of the WFO and NOAA co-ops there, Jacksonville, Tampa, and Miami. All these offices and our headquarters contributed tremendously to the successful effort that we had with Michael. Next slide, please. As you watch the animation there of the visible imagery of Michael, it was striking during the morning of that Wednesday, watching, from early morning through landfall, the structural changes and the intensification that you could see on satellite, and just how quickly the storm was spinning. It was really awful to watch. It was of course Category 5 after an upgrade of several weeks back. If it had not been upgraded, it still would have been the first Category 4 to make landfall in the Florida Panhandle. So unlike other parts of the Gulf, this area has not been struck by a storm like this during the historical record. It was the latest Category 5 to make landfall in the U.S. For Georgia residents that were expecting the next major hurricane to strike Savannah or the southeast coast, probably shocked to have the next major hurricane actually strike southwest Georgia. So major hurricane status all the way across the Florida Panhandle. Third strongest hurricane by pressure and the fourth strongest hurricane by wind to make landfall. And the 46 millibar drop in 24 hours and that 9 millibar drop in the final 3 hours was just awful. It was literally like watching a horror movie, seeing the reports come back in from the aircraft, how rapidly it was intensifying. Next slide, please. So we just advanced this slowly. What we did here was we juxtaposed radar imagery with wind measurement sites. It's important to note that not a single wind measurement equipment survived Hurricane Michael. Not just NWS equipment or NOAA equipment, weather stem equipment did not make it. Deployed equipment from Florida did not make it. So we don't know what the peak winds were. The radar image there on the right shows both sides of the scale pegged at 140 knots in and out, a couple thousand feet above the ground. So we'll never know exactly. But you can see here, the stars indicate where the measurement was before the highest measurement when it failed. And to step through these, give about a 3-second pause on each of these. 98 knots at Port St. Joe, 121 knots at Tyndall Air Force Base. You can advance it. 101 knots in Panama City at failure time. Well inland, Marianna failed at 89 knots, well away from the core of the strongest winds. And we had 100-knot gust measured well inland, well up into Georgia at Donaldsonville. So the impacts in the timber industry were massive. I drove through the damage path yesterday, coming back from a meeting up in Alabama, and it looks like a war zone coming along I-10 as you get into there. It's really, really horrible to look at. But there were billions of dollars in lost timber. Next slide. You see the image of Mexico Beach. There's a coastal road that runs a couple blocks inland that really marked the edge of the most significant surge. Peak surge was around 14 feet above dirt there. The damage, most of the damage was caused by just the wave action on top of the 14-foot surge, and it was pretty horrific. And I'll show you some of the images as we step forward. Some of the wind damage, a lot of EF2 type wind damage around Panama City, a little bit of EF3. The tree damage was catastrophic. Next slide. You can see here in Marianna, this is well inland. Structural damage to buildings downtown. And you notice on the left is a strip mall building. And if you look at the image on the bottom left, you can actually see where that building was pushed about 3 feet off of its foundation. So the entire structure was actually moved. Next slide. We had 8, and 8 fatalities is 8 too many, of course, but with a category 5 hitting a population center of 175,000 people, we feared it would be much worse. So 5 deaths. You notice the demographics of the surge victims on the southwest part of the damage there. The youngest being 60, the oldest being 91. The tree damage was all trees falling on homes, and we'll show some of those images as we step through. Next slide, please. Agnes Vicari, you can see the middle picture there is what was left of her home. The top left is the image, the before picture, and you can see on the top right where that home was located as it applies to Mexico Beach. In Mexico Beach, there was 2 types of homes. There are these 1950s through maybe the 60s slab on grade homes. They didn't make it, especially inside the coastal highway, and those are where all of our fatalities were. Step forward, please. You can see the story, Agnes, and I won't leave this up there too long, but Agnes was urged by family members to get out, and at the last minute, she did realize she should have left and didn't. So, terrible situation. Next slide, please. Donald Vonderhaar, you can see the before and after of his home there in Mexico Beach, again, just a couple blocks away from Agnes. Next slide. And Sandra Lucas Detrick in Bay County, again, I imagine these people ran into each other walking their dogs and out in the area, but you can see the before and after picture of another slab on grade home in Mexico Beach. Next slide, please. William McConnell was our only Gulf County fatality. He stayed, and as the eye wall overspread, he decided to try to evacuate his home, and he was swept off of the road in his vehicle. You can see his vehicle there in the lagoon at the bottom right. Next slide, please. Here's a mobile home in Jackson County where John Gombos died. A large tree fell on the mobile home. Next slide. Steve Sweet and his wife in Gadsden County were on their porch watching the winds pick up. They made the decision to get off their porch and go back inside. As they did that, this tree fell on their home. You can see the before and after. You can actually see the tree there in front that fell on their home. His wife survived. Steve was crushed by the tree. All right, so I think I mentioned before, you can go ahead and next slide. So we had 3 Weather Service EOC deployments. The first was Bay. And I think it's important to note that we had not done local EOC deployments at the Tallahassee office before. This was something that we learned with Harvey and Corpus Christi with deployments to Victoria and Corpus, how valuable it was to have a meteorologist at the EOC for these significant hurricane landfalls. We deployed Justin Pullen, one of our meteorologists to the Bay County EOC. Just step slowly through these pictures if you don't mind. You can see here he is briefing everyone at the Emergency Operations Center with their Web EOC information on the screen behind him. Next slide. Here's Justin's workstation at the Emergency Operations Center there, including Web EOC. One more picture. And one of the things that was really, really good with this was Justin was given a seat in the command and control room, not just in the Emergency Operations Center. So Justin was literally next to the emergency manager and the chiefs as they made their evacuation calls decisions, and that was critical. Next slide, please. All right, Leon County, Lauren Nash went there, very busy EOC. You can step slow through these pictures, please. A lot of media interviews, media interest, so it was nice to have, instead of the mayor having to talk about the weather, we had a meteorologist there that could tell people about the weather, and she did a lot of that. You can see how active and busy the Emergency Operations Center was there, and the last slide shows where she actually had an office she could work in and do some of her stuff, so that was nice to have. And then we have one more deployment that we sent to Florida State. In this case, we had a meteorologist from the Miami office, Robert Garcia, come up. He had worked if you step forward, and go one more slide. The emergency manager there seated on the right, Kurt, was the former Miami-Dade County emergency manager. He started about 2 weeks before me at Florida State as the emergency manager. So he knew Robert, and we also knew that the Florida State has facilities on the Gulf at both Panama City and in McCullough County, south of Tallahassee. So it was important to be able to support their decisions as well with the meteorologist. So that worked out very well. Next slide. All right, I'll wrap up with a couple lessons learned and applied. Definitely some of the things we learned with Harvey and the landfall there did help with Michael. We learned with Harvey that it's not enough to have hotel rooms reserved. You've got to make sure the hotel rooms are going to have power. So we found a hotel in downtown Tallahassee that was on the main power line, right through. It was on the core. It was going to be the first line that was restored. Plus, they had a full building generator. So that was key because most folks couldn't get home safely for 2 or 3 days. A few people for 5 days. So we really, weather offices are not designed for 24, 25 people to live in for a long period of time. So we crashed here during the hurricane, and then as soon as the winds dropped below tropical storm force, we had hotel rooms where basically the midnight shift and the day shift just shared a room, and that worked out really well. We lost our internet about an hour before landfall, had to go on full service backup, but using Florida State's wireless internet, we were able to maintain our decision support role in terms of briefing, social media, and that kind of stuff. That was critical. We needed more laptops. We were handing laptops off from briefer to briefer to do things, but it worked out okay. We had learned during Harvey, you need to have IT expertise and management on duty 24/7 during these events. Things are going to break. GFE is going to have issues. You need to have someone that can fix it. And all hands on deck model really worked. Next slide. We actually dedicated the Houston meteorologist. Sean Lush was deployed here from the Houston office on Wednesday. His job was basically to support our 3 deployees. So instead of the 3 people having to just rely on the help from the office, we had someone dedicated to them. So if there were graphic needs or answers to questions or any kind of thing, they had a point of contact that was constantly working with them. After the storm, we used the DAT to draw polygons to help coordinate where survey teams would go. Around 2,000 data points were gathered after the storm, and it really was a Herculean effort that required a lot of coordination.
Hey, Tom,
yeah.
Can you explain what the DAT is real quick?
The Damage Assessment Toolkit is an app that the National Weather Service uses. Actually, our science officer here at Parks Camp is the lead developer for that. So it's just a GIS tool, like a collector app that we go out and gather post-storm data. And we did gather a lot of surge information that doesn't have right now. A future version will. That currently doesn't have the ability to do storm surge. So we basically just gathered it as a damage point, and then in the comments called it surge and put the details in. So that was very useful. And then we did a full day of tropical training late September. So typically you wrap up your tropical training rhythms during May, April, that kind of thing. But we had a lot of new people come in, and just as a refresher, the hurricane season here really does go well into November. So we thought it was a good idea. Our tropical focal point and some others on our team thought it was a good idea to actually do some full-on training, a full day in September. So that was fresh in everyone's mind as the storm made landfall. Next slide. And next time, this is something we're talking with the Hurricane Center now. It's something we heard from folks in Alabama yesterday. It's something that we heard from our emergency operations centers during Michael. Folks need to have when the winds are going to subside so that they can get their response and recovery teams out. We had 5 times as many deaths from Michael after the storm as during the storm. So I think surviving the aftermath is a message that we're going to push out there to folks that don't, and Ken Graham, when he talks about it, you don't want to be out there with the manual in one hand and the chainsaw in the other hand trying to figure out how that thing works. Those things are dangerous, as are any kind of generator system. So we had a lot of the fatalities were related to chainsaw issues, to carbon monoxide. There was 3 suicides. There was a lot of issues with power companies coming in, and just it's just a bad environment. So we want to make sure we're doing better next time, messaging that both during the storm and after the storm, that everything we can do. For major hurricanes, we've got to really think about how we're doing our observing equipment. Do we want to have weather equipment that can survive 150 mile-an-hour winds or not? If not, we're not going to have good measurements in the future. Our deployee to Bay County was there about 4 to 5 days and worked a lot of 16 to 18-hour days during his time there. So for significant hurricanes, I really want to look at sending more than one deployee out. We've got to fill the staff behind it, but you're asking a lot to have someone work 4 or 5, 16 to 18-hour days. And we invited Dr. Laura Myers in, and she went to Bay County and spoke with almost 1,000 people, I believe, and has got a lot of findings from the decisions that were made there to stay or to go. And actually was just presented that information on Friday. We're kind of distilling it now. but we want to incorporate all of those social science findings into our messaging for this season. And we're working on that as we speak. I think there might be a last slide. That's it. So that was my presentation. I hope that was in line with what y'all are looking to do today. It was, I could not be more proud of the performance of our partners here in Florida, in the Florida Panhandle, and Alabama and Georgia, and of the crew here at Tallahassee that was as ready for this storm as the Weather Forecast Office can be.
Wow, that was great, Tom. That was just tremendous. Just really sobering to see the impacts that Hurricane Michael had there, especially in Mexico Beach. And I'm glad to hear that you got Dr. Laura Myers in there. About it's interesting how you had many more fatalities after just surviving the impacts. I like that. I'm glad we're looking into that as well. Hard lessons to learn, but I'm thankful to see that you guys are moving forward with those lessons.
Thank you.
Very good. Ms. Rebecca, I know that we're having trouble with your internet there, but do you want to go ahead and try to give your presentation?
Yes, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Fantastic. I think I troubleshooted the tech issues. This is a real world example of collaborating with partners. DHS, we are blocked from Google applications, and I'm actually also traveling. I'm currently at South Carolina Emergency Management Agency, and then they've got restrictions on their internet, and so I finally got it figured out. So yes, I'm traveling today, so always a good time. My name is Rebecca Moulton. I'm a meteorologist for FEMA Region 4, and Region 4 is in Atlanta, and the states that we provide support to are Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Kentucky. So there's never a dull moment here. And when I say I'm a meteorologist, I don't forecast. I primarily am aggregating all of the various information. We have 30 WFOs in our region. We've got 3 different regional headquarters, each with slightly different protocols sometimes. And of course, all of the national centers, river forecast products. And so a lot of what we're doing is aggregating that and then providing the emergency management analysis of what that means in terms of the planning products that we produce in our response activities. So with that, if you want to pull up my slides. I wanted to give a brief overview. I think this is actually the second slide. Yeah, there's the first slide. I wanted to give a brief overview of my role as it relates to hurricanes, because we have 6 coastal states, and so we've been very busy the past several years. And I have a 2-sided role. One is I deploy to the National Hurricane Center, and our states can interact with me there as a liaison, as well as our region, letting the hurricane forecasters do the forecasting, and we are able to quickly translate that information to our state partners for their planning as they're considering evacuations and response. The other side is I may be staying in our regional response coordination center, and in that role, I'm supporting all of the ESF's emergency support functions, so the other federal agencies, especially people like the DOT, the Red Cross, and logistics planners. So I wear 2 hats depending on what's going on. This slide that you see is from a previous storm, and that shows our former Administrator Fugate, along with the previous president and his cabinet at our National Response Center. And it gives you a feel for what it looks like sometimes on the briefings that are conducted, the FEMA interagency briefings. They are top-level briefings that happen once a day whenever there's a hurricane. And we help facilitate these briefings so that the Hurricane Center is providing information out to all of the federal and state partners at one time, so that there's one clear message and the Hurricane Center can really hit on the questions folks might have. If you go to the next slide, This is an idea of our deployments. This is not from 2018 because we're still crunching the numbers on that. But from 2017, which was also a very busy year, these are on the left-hand side, some of the members of our team. And it shows you just how many days we were deployed. During Irma, we were actually hit by the storm. So I spent the night at the National Hurricane Center, and we had a crew at WPC, which is the backup location for both the National Hurricane Center and the HLT operations. So we did a little bit of that while we were supporting Irma. And it was a very busy month of September. As you can see, August, September, and October, we're all running around somewhere doing some type of support for most of the months. If you go to the next slide, wanted to show a picture of what it looks like from our point of view. If this is Rodney Rose, who's our technical specialist and runs a lot of the fancy equipment to make the magic happen in terms of our video teleconference. But you see Dr. Michael Brennan, he is actually providing a briefing. And if you peek on the other wall, you can see folks in the FEMA NRCC and what they look like as they're grimacing usually when we are showing them the forecasters. So it's a team effort between the Hurricane Center, FEMA, and some federal partners, but really the Weather Service. We have two full-time liaisons at the National Hurricane Center year-round. So this is about the size of our office. It's pretty small quarters there, but because they're there 24/7, we really have a very tight relationship with the Hurricane Center, and on both sides, they are really plugged in. In fact, Dr. Brennan is here at the meeting that I'm at. We're plugged in with them, they're plugged in with us, and can be tied to the hip with our states. If you go to the next slide, this is a picture of me when I was a young child. This is during Hurricane Arthur. And we joke because I've got the essentials for emergency management: coffee, food, and a phone. I like this photo because it's the first storm that I had a record of texting fast and furiously during an event. I'm sure that we had texting before 2012, but I can't really find a documented example of it. So it's relatively recent, and you would think that in terms of communication and relaying information, it might streamline and expedite what we do, but actually the number of conference calls that we have haven't changed. In some cases, they've gone up. The number of calls. So it just underlies the importance of that face-to-face relationships and then calling people and hearing from each other. We have so many of our state partners say that when they hear the National Hurricane Center or the National Weather Service do a briefing, they can glean information just from the tone of their voice. And that's something that really, it only happens if you have a strong partnership. So our role is really to help facilitate that partnership and make it happen like ninjas behind the scenes, so that when we have a storm, we're all already connected. If you go to the next slide, I think I have a few more here. Here's another view. Again, that's Administrator Fugate and former Hurricane Center Director Bill Reed. And I don't remember this storm because it's been a long several years. I'm guessing that would be well before Matthew. Maybe that's Joaquin. I can't remember. But the point of this slide is just to give you, when they're sitting at the head of that table that you saw with Dr. Brennan's briefing, this is what it looks like from their point of view. And it's just a small number of all of the different entities on the other end of this phone. So it really underscores we spend a lot of time working to ensure that the information being briefed is fast, because we only get a few minutes on these calls. And when I say we, I don't do the briefing. It's either the National Hurricane Center Director or someone from the WPC, like Dave Novak or Greg Carbon. It just depends on what the type of storm is, but we really help them hit. These are the questions people want to know. And all of these partners are hearing the same message at the same time, direct from the highest possible source, and it really carries some weight when you get the directors on there in terms of decisions that might be going on. And if people are unsure, then that tends to twist their arms a little bit. So I think that's all the slides I have. There's obviously so much more. Oh, the final slide I'll touch on, essential elements of information. So my role really is not, again, relaying forecast information specifically. I can help people get that information. That information is widely out there, but what we look at are, what are the essential elements of information in terms of our lifelines? So basically, we translate that meteorology into emergency management language for the reports they need to do, for the analysis they need to do, or the logistics. I may be answering questions like, which roads may be wet? Can we stage something at Fort Bragg, or do we need to look at a different airfield? All of those things, knowing what these essential elements are ahead of time and being a part of the planning process helps me answer them operationally. So we can gather the operational status right from our states who we're talking with. We know whether evacuations are going to be ordered by the governor in some states or home rule and done county by county. And this helps us get an understanding of, from their planning efforts, what the roadways might look like when they're loaded, whether everyone's going to go at the same time like we saw in Irma, or whether, like in South Carolina, the governor issues an evacuation order and they have a very organized process for only 3 conglomerates. So that just scratches the surface of a little bit of what we do, and as it transitions from planning to operations. This is our final slide. This is kind of our quote. It's a highly dynamic situation that requires constant monitoring. When someone asks us and we don't have an easy answer, this is our go-to phrase because it really sort of sums everything up. So that's all I have. I don't know if we're taking questions now or later, but I'll be happy to hang out and stand by.
Very good. You did a great job presenting, and I think you chimed right along with what Tom was talking about. How, one of his first slides talk about the team effort it took from the National Weather Service to get everybody just there in Tallahassee to support them for Hurricane Michael, and I liked your theme of just the team effort across all the federal government and all the the national and regional partners that you're working with to make sure that you understand the situation. As a meteorologist, you even said you're not even forecasting it, but you still play a vital and important role of taking all that forecaster and that weather terminology and transmitting it and translating it to emergency manager talk, which I know is an important role so they can understand what the meteorologists are saying. So it's just very impressive how you can get all of that done at such a high level.
It takes a lot of what we call blue skies collaboration, so that when I see that the Hurricane Center is shifting the forecast right a pencil width of a degree, I know what that means in terms of, okay, this means you have 6 fewer hours to evacuate before you hit your clearance time. So yeah, it requires that year-round partnership, and then knowing what the questions they are really trying to answer are and how to quickly interpret for them and help them answer. Because unfortunately, they don't have, it's ironic, but I tell people a lot that even during a Category 5 hurricane, the weather is not the most important information to a lot of emergency managers. And a lot of times they hear it multiple times. They've got to make a lot of other decisions very quickly. So we get a very brief amount of time, and we don't want to focus on things that they have already heard, or we'll lose their trust, we'll lose their interest. So really cultivating the way to communicate with them and those essential elements of information that are going to change the outcome for them, that's something that's a constant effort.
Very true. And, I like what you said earlier about the blue sky partnership, is that right before landfall is not the time to be making these contacts and touching people, touching base with people. It takes months and months and years of work to develop those relationships ahead of time. All right, I'm going to move on now to Mr. Chris Gilson. He's a broadcast meteorologist out of Orlando, and he's going to be I believe you're going to be talking on kind of messaging with the hurricane season.
Yeah, so last year here in Orlando, we were not affected, obviously, directly by any of the hurricanes, but we're always on guard. So even though we had Florence in the Carolinas and Michael, which kind of grazed the west coast of Florida, or at least tracked along the west coast of Florida, definitely all eyes on the tropics last year. And we have Spectrum News is a nationwide company, so we have news outlets in Charlotte and Raleigh. So we were heavily involved in Florence last year, working with the meteorologist, the broadcast meteorologist there in Charlotte and Raleigh. And then, of course, with Michael last year, we were also watching the track and did extensive live coverage with crews in the field around Tallahassee, Panama City, and Mexico Beach last October. And then we did live coverage throughout the day on air because everybody in Florida, of course, interested in the tropics when something is going on. So last year, of course, we had Florence was the first storm of the season. Everybody remembers that in September. Florence was expecting to be a major category 3, 4, or 5 hurricane when it was making landfall or approaching North Carolina. Of course, we know it slowed down, lost its intensity. The track always stayed the same, but the intensity was changing as it got closer to the coast because its speed was slowing down, so it was weakening. So from a broadcast perspective, of course, we put a lot of focus on the intensity of a storm. And people get hung up on putting a lot on the Saffir-Simpson scale and the intensity of the category of the storm. So as it was getting closer, the intensity was coming down. People thought that it was losing its intensity, so they decided to stay. So I think from a broadcast perspective, last year what we learned is that we can't just focus on the overall intensity, which is what everybody wants to focus on. Same story when we are looking at severe weather in the plain states, tornadoes versus heavy rain and flooding. So last year, I think one of the big takeaways is we have to communicate a broader scale, all the hazards that could come with the system, and just not focusing on just how intense the storm is. So with Michael also had a track that was pretty much on par with where it was going, and it never changed. It just spun up really quickly. So it developed on Sunday into a tropical storm, I remember correctly, and then eventually by Monday it was a hurricane. At that point, on Monday, some of the forecast models, I think it was the Euro, was actually showing it becoming a major Category 4, potentially a Category 5 hurricane as it approached the panhandle of Florida. And this is a case where if one model, forecast model that we're looking at is an outlier, how do you communicate that this is the worst case scenario? Instead of just focusing on the fact that at first it was looking like maybe it was going to be a Category 1, Category 2, but then there were some suggestions there that it was going to be even stronger than that. So you have to communicate, again, broad hazards, worst case scenario, this could be a major Category 4, Category 5 hurricane without being an alarmist. So one of the things in TV is you don't want to be an alarmist, you don't want to hype a situation up because that's just as bad as downplaying the situation. However, you have to play out every scenario that could come across. So the intensity of the hurricane and also the flooding hazards that come with it. So with Florence, we saw the flooding hazards. That was the primary threat with Hurricane Florence. It was going to be a slow-moving storm, regardless of its category, whether it was a Category 4 or Category 1. It just sat there and spun over the coast. Wilmington had record rainfall, and we know that flooding is one of the primary causes of deaths in storm situations, hurricanes, or in severe weather situations. And it's interesting to look at the Florence death toll versus Michael's death toll. Michael, of course, Category 5, 16 direct deaths, 22 direct deaths from Florence, which was a Category 1 at landfall. So it's about taking away last year was communicating all the risks, all the scenarios, all the hazards that come with these storms. And sometimes I think we get too caught up in just focusing on the overall intensity of the storm, whether it's a Category 1, Category 4, or 5. So we use these graphics here explaining Category 1, you're going to have strong, potentially damaging winds, but see here in this graphic, it looks like your house is going to be just fine. Whereas a Category 5, everything's going to be obliterated. But as we saw with Florence and also with Harvey in Texas, these storms slow down, can dump a lot of heavy rain, leading to flooding, which leads to deaths just as much as a strong Category 5 hurricane. So I think in a broadcast community, last year was definitely a lesson learned that we need to be better at messaging the overall hazards that we have with each of these storms without being an alarmist, but at the same time being an effective communicator with all the hazards that come with tropical storms and hurricanes.
This is Becca. I just have one comment on this graphic. And, you know, when you look at the Category 5 graphic, you see the storm surge, you know, that goes along with the heavy rain and winds and whatnot. And you're right, you know, with a Category 1 graphic like this, even with a Category 1 storm, as it's making landfall, it could have been, you know, a major hurricane as it was offshore. And it could really potentially build up that storm surge as it's approaching the coast. And so, you know, this graphic itself, maybe, you know, it might be a Cat 1 with the wind speeds of 74 to 95, but the storm surge on top of the rain and whatnot could look like a Category 5,
Right.
or we're seeing in this Category 5 image. So, I mean, your points are spot on that, you know, we need to, as a meteorological community, just message the fact that, hey, you know, the winds might have died down, but, you know, this was a major hurricane offshore, so it's still going to push all this water inland with the storm surge and drop lots of heavy rain. So it's a very tough subject to wrap our heads around, and how we can effectively communicate those major hazards, even in a simple graphic like this. How do you do that? And that's a really, really tough question to answer, but certainly one that we, as a meteorology community, forecast community, need to. I'm not sure if answer is the right word, but we need to put our heads together and wrap our heads around how do we effectively message this to our public and to get the most effective response from our people.
Right, and especially in this day and age, it's hard to for the public sometimes to listen to the media. So effectively communicating to them so that it relates to them, but also relates to them in a way that gives you credibility without hyping the storm, because they think everything's fake or blown out of proportion. So we live in a dynamic age, especially in this time frame, not only with what we saw with Florence and Harvey, the natural causes, but also the dynamics with media right now. So having messaging that's on point, that relates to people, that they'll believe, is important right now.
You know, one of the things that I find interesting is that, and maybe this is my perspective, but I would say, you know, 10, 20 years ago, we were working real hard just to get that track of that forecast for the hurricane right. But now, you know, we've gotten that science pretty good, but now, you know, it's being revealed that, you know, just getting that forecast track correct, there's so many other threats. And I think now that we've kind of eliminated one kind of variable, that we're getting better and better at getting that track of that hurricane correct. But now we're, you know, having to consider the storm surge and any associated rainfall, even tornadoes associated with landfalling hurricanes. We're getting down to some of those other threats related to the hurricane. Whereas, you know, in the past, we were just struggling to get the track right. So I think you're right that the messaging going forward is getting more and more complex, because we've got part of it, you know, we fine-tuned it, that we're getting better at it, but now it gives us the opportunity to actually message these other things.
Yeah, and Florence's track never changed. Michael's track never changed. And if I remember correctly, Harvey's track never changed either. It was just the intensity of the storms changed over time pretty rapidly. And as we mentioned, the other factors that come with these storms, the flooding, the storm surge, tornadoes.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I did want to remind everyone who's watching that you can ask any of our panelists a question by using the hashtag NWAWebWed on Twitter. Kind of monitoring the tweets. Miss Hannah is happily tweeting away pictures from our presenters so you can see them a little more clearly. So if you guys do have any questions for any of our panelists, feel free to tweet us a quick question. All right. Now that we've kind of looked back at last year's hurricane season, We want to look forward now to the 2019 hurricane season, which we just started officially a few days ago. But I believe we, as in the last several years, we've actually had a named system before the hurricane season even officially started this year. So that's kind of been a trend lately. But we're going to turn things over to Dr. Jerry now and see what he has for us.
Well, thank you, and good day to everyone. Well, hurricane season is here. It runs from June 1st through the end of November. NOAA issued its updated, or its 2019 seasonal hurricane outlook on May 23rd, just prior to the season, and we'll also update this outlook in early August, which coincides with the onset of the peak months of the hurricane season. At this time, we think that a near normal season is most likely. But that's a lot of activity. We're expecting 9 to 15 named storms, of which we think 4 to 8 could become hurricanes, and 2 to 4 of those could become major hurricanes, category 3 or stronger. Next. Now, these ranges are centered on the longer-term seasonal averages. An average season is about 12 named storms, 6 hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes. And as I mentioned, predicting a near normal season doesn't mean a low activity season. It means there's going to be a lot of activity. Next. Now remember, these seasonal outlooks, if you can go back for a second, the outlooks are for the overall seasonal activity. It's not a hurricane landfall forecast, and it's not a prediction of where the hurricane can strike any particular region. And the reason is that how strong a hurricane is when it makes landfall, how many storms strike, the damage they do. Those things are really dependent on the weather patterns that are in place at the time the storm is approaching. And those weather patterns just simply are not predictable this far in advance. Next. So to put this outlook into perspective, and this perspective also then helps to highlight some of the climate factors that we look at that allow us oftentimes to make pretty accurate forecasts for the season as a whole. This is a time series of the Atlantic major hurricanes per year going back to 1950. The forecast, the outlook for this year is on the right, 2 to 4. So you see several things. You see there's a lot of variability from one year to the next, but also there's a very strong longer term pattern. The 1950s and 60s were a high activity era for the Atlantic. We averaged 3 to 4 major hurricanes a season. Then the low activity era came in, the climate pattern that was forcing that high activity era reversed. And during 71 to 94, we only had 2 above normal seasons, and we averaged about 1.5 major hurricanes. That's literally more than a cut in half of the major hurricanes between high activity and low activity era. Well, that climate pattern jumped back, reversed to what we saw in the 50s and 60s back in 1995. And since 1995, we've been in another high activity era, again, averaging about 3.4 major hurricanes per season, or again, more than double what we saw in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. It turns out that much of this year-to-year and decade-to-decade variability is predictable because there's a couple of dominant climate patterns that really control the activity. So by predicting those climate patterns, we can often say something intelligent about the upcoming strength of the hurricane season. Next. One of those climate patterns is the El Nino-La Nina cycle, or ENSO. El Nino mainly produces year-to-year changes in Atlantic hurricane activity. El Nino, I've just got a schematic on the top left. That refers to when conditions are warmer and wetter across the eastern half of the equatorial Pacific Ocean. El Nino produces stronger upper-level westerly winds over the Atlantic. That produces stronger wind shear. Strong wind shear suppresses hurricane activity. If a developing system moves into an area of strong shear, it generally won't develop. Or if a hurricane moves into a region of strong shear, it gets ripped apart. So the wind shear is a very, very important factor, not in only predicting the evolution of a given hurricane, but also predicting what the overall hurricane season will be. Now, El Nino's counterpart is La Nina. La Nina refers to when it's cooler and drier than average over the eastern half of the equatorial Pacific Ocean. La Nina results in weaker wind shear over the Atlantic, which favors more hurricane activity. Next slide. Now there's the completely different climate pattern. It's called the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation, or AMO. This is the pattern that's responsible for those multi-decadal cycles in the Atlantic hurricanes, and I showed you the time series for the major hurricanes. On the top right is the climate pattern for a high activity era. That's the pattern we're in now. That's the pattern we saw in the 1950s and 60s. It's associated with warmer tropical Atlantic temperatures, weaker wind shear in the Atlantic main development region, and very importantly, also a stronger West African monsoon system. This combination of factors sets up an entire set of conditions that favor more and stronger hurricanes. From things like making it easier for the African easterly waves or tropical cloud systems to spin up as they move westward from Africa, to remain more in more conducive conditions longer, to have farther westward tracks where they can then impact the U.S. It's an entire interrelated set of conditions that this pattern produces. Hang on a second. In contrast, what we saw in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s was the cold phase of the AMO, and here was cooler tropical Atlantic temperatures, stronger wind shear, weaker West African monsoon, and the result was significantly less hurricane activity. So really predicting these climate patterns and their interaction, that's really the fundamental underlying basis for the seasonal hurricane outlooks. Next slide. This year, we have El Nino in place. El Nino is expected to continue through the hurricane season. It's expected to produce overall stronger shear, especially more in the western part of the basin over the Caribbean Sea. Next. And as I mentioned, with this ongoing high activity era, we're still seeing these conditions that have been in place since 1995 that favor more activity. So it's because of these competing factors this year that we think a near normal season is most likely. Next. So what does that mean? Well, going back to what some of the other speakers talked about, there's huge impacts along both the Atlantic and Gulf Coast. And did you know that 80 million people are considered Atlantic Gulf Coast residents, Atlantic or Gulf Coast residents that can be impacted by a tropical storm or hurricane? Example, last year we saw with Michael's very long inland track. We saw millions of people being impacted by Hurricane Florence's flooding last year in the Carolinas. So a lot of people are potentially impacted by every single storm that develops or threatens. Next slide. And I know these have been touched on, but I want to hit a little bit different perspective. Last year, Hurricanes Florence and Michael caused over $50 billion in damage, over 100 lives lost. But as Chris was talking about, each had really different characteristics and impacts. And on the left, we're showing Hurricane Florence rainfall totals, just 30, 40 inches of rain, massive rain through the Carolinas, tremendous inland flooding. That was if you had to pick the biggest impact, that flooding was the major impact. And this huge flooding is typical of a slow-moving tropical storm or hurricane, or with a system with a long overland track. In contrast, Hurricane Michael, as we were talking a little bit earlier, developed very quickly in the southern Gulf of Mexico, strengthened and went to Category 5, 160 mile an hour winds. Day and 3/4 later, it was already making landfall in Florida. Because the storm was so strong, the storm surge was so strong, it was complete devastation along the coast, and inland flooding was not that much of an issue. Michael dropped maybe 5 to 10 inches along its path, and so flooding was less of an issue. Instead, it was more of the typical coastal type of impacts that we think about with major hurricanes. Next, please. Now, having issued the outlook, the first thing we say is you need to prepare for every hurricane season regardless of the outlook. We all know it only takes one storm to strike your area to make for a bad year. We've had major hurricanes. Andrew is an example. We decimated southern Florida in an otherwise very low activity year. We know we've had big hurricanes and high activity years. Again, it only takes one storm to cause a very bad time in your area. If you can go back for a second. There's a couple of great websites for preparedness. FEMA's ready.gov website and the Hurricane Center's hurricane.gov website. They have a lot of information on things that you can think about and start getting ready so that you're ready with your preparedness kit in case a hurricane threatens. It's not complicated stuff. You just have to do it. Next slide. But your hurricane preparedness plans not only need to reflect your personal situation, they also need to reflect the likely storm conditions you might expect. Are you in a coastal zone where storm surge will wipe out everything? And then in that case, you would be in a mandatory evacuation zone. So you need to have prepared to evacuate. And there's good information on those websites to get you ready. Or is the main impact, you're well off the coast, main impact may be from inland flooding like we saw in the Carolinas. When these hurricanes strike, a lot of times they produce a lot of tornadoes. Maybe tornado damage or devastating winds, down trees and power lines would be your biggest impacts. Maybe you're going to hunker down and stay in place. You need food, water, things like that for several days. Maybe you're a surfer and you need to be aware of rip currents so you don't get washed out to sea. Next slide. So again, the key message is not what we're expecting this season. The key message is that it's hurricane season. Storms are going to form and storms are going to threaten. So coastal residents being one of 80 million, you need to prepare for every hurricane season regardless of the seasonal outlook. Next. It only takes one. Be ready and take action. I think that's it. Next. That's it. Thank you.
Very good, Dr. Bell. I have one quick question for you. It came in on Twitter. Question, if I interpreted it right, have you guys seen a difference between like an El Nino, a strong El Nino season versus a weak El Nino season? Because, the differences in the sea surface temperatures, does that make a difference, or is it just El Nino in general versus La Nina? You get those opposites.
The strength of El Nino makes a difference. A stronger El Nino would produce stronger wind shear. Many of the below normal or near normal seasons we've seen since 1995, the activity was reduced because of El Nino. So sure, the strength of El Nino is very important. And that's one of the reasons we give ranges of activity, because some of the models are predicting El Nino to be stronger this year. Some are saying, well, maybe El Nino will fade. At this time, the consensus of the models is for a relatively weak El Nino, but with some impacts. So that's why we give ranges, because there's always uncertainty in these climate factors. These climate factors do not say, oh yeah, there's going to be 15 storms this season. No, they give you a likely range of activity that you can expect for the season, given these climate factors and the inherent uncertainty associated with making predictions like this.
So now that Dr. Bell has enlightened us on what we potentially could see, I want to open it up to everybody and ask you guys a question. In light of what Dr. Bell kind of laid out as the potential for this season, what lessons did you learn from last year's hurricane season that you'd like to implement in this year's hurricane season going forward? Anyone can just jump in when you want to.
Well, with our messaging, and the messaging goes hand in hand with these hurricane season outlooks. I never do a press interview without talking about hurricane preparedness and the different ways storms can impact you. And that just has to be repeated an infinite number of times, because it's very easy to forget. And as I think Chris was mentioning, where maybe the full message doesn't get across a lot of times to people, and they're focusing only on the strength of the storm. I remember back when Hurricane Katrina struck. Well, it was a Category 5, but was weakening. The winds were weakening to 150 miles an hour or something like that. one of the news things, their main thing was Katrina's weakening. And I talked to that reporter. I said, no, the main thing is Hurricane Katrina is going to kill you. That's the news. The silliness of 5 miles an hour or something is just that. And I think Chris really addressed that issue. But that's something that we even dealt with, more than a decade ago. And we're still dealing with issues like this.
Tom, do you have any lessons learned there for you guys there in Tallahassee?
Yeah, I hit on it, I think, in my presentation about taking the findings from our social science work that we did contribute to. My team was out with Dr. Myers for the whole week and applying that both for post-storm messaging and pre-storm messaging. So that's the main takeaway for us, along with just a lot of operational holes that we've been plugging in the last few months.
Can you give us a quick insight into that, or is that still under wraps? You guys are still kind of going over it. We're
still distilling it. I mean, there's, I think that, that obviously folks that had evacuated before unnecessarily, that affected their decision this time. It was a lot of interesting human factors going into that. Stuff like people had illness, so they left because they had just had surgery, and that was the reason they left. There's so much data in there that we really need time to get through it all.
I look forward. I assume that Dr. Myers and others and you all will be presenting those at upcoming conferences and sharing that. So I look forward to that information, because that sounds like it could be a great benefit, not only to where you guys are, but to anywhere, like Dr. Bell said there, the 80 million people along the Gulf Coast, along the Atlantic coast. Good information to have.
I think a lot of it will be out at Huntsville.
Oh, very good. Very good. And at Huntsville, I assume you're referring to the NWA conference there.
Yeah, yes.
Very good. Hey, Chris,
going back to Dr. Bell's point about we went through Katrina and how it was weakening, and the message was it was weakening, but still obviously deadly, dangerous storm. It just goes with complacency, because after those couple of years in the 2000s that we had that stretch of hurricanes from Charlie to Katrina, people forget about it. They lose sight of it, and we probably lose sight of it as a community too, in the broadcast community, focusing on the intensity of the storm instead of all the hazards that come with it.
Very good.
Another thing with the messaging I've been trying to just reemphasize this year was just the huge difference in the amount of time that you had to act just between Florence and Michael. With Florence, the storm was, it was pretty well forecasted. The track is way out, out to sea. There were several days. You had 3-4 days knowing the storm was coming. Okay, so fine. But now you've got Michael spins up all of a sudden becomes a hurricane, and then is 160 miles an hour and destroying everything less than 2 days later. If you're not prepared with your evacuation plans and can get out, it's an example of there's some cases where you don't have time to start thinking about how you're going to prepare. It needs to have been done, and you need to get out.
I think that's sorry to interrupt. I think that
no, go ahead.
I think, Tom, you had mentioned that's something to really look into, investigate, and sort of highlighting that more, is the fact that some of these major hurricanes spin up so quickly. You said, Tom, I think that if a hurricane, or if a Category 5 hurricane hits landfall I can't remember exactly what you said, 120 hours or so in the future, that'd be remarkable.
Yeah, if the next Cat 5 was a hurricane 72 hours prior to landfall, it'd be the first time.
Yeah. And so that's a very strong message to say, you're going to have to move quickly. If one of these hurricanes is spins up and it's got a healthy environment, you don't have a lot of time to prepare. So get that preparedness, get your plan ready well in advance. Right now is a perfect time when we've got quiet season, or quiet start to the season so far. And I shouldn't say that, because we already had a storm out there. Anyway, it's quiet out there right now. So my point is to start preparing yourself now. And that's a very important message to relay and to just hammer home.
And back on the question Tim had about Dr. Myers' research, one thing that did come out from speaking with folks in Bay County was folks really didn't trigger a personal evacuation decision until Category 3. And we could spend all day talking about hurricane categories and the weaknesses and strengths, right. but we know that now, and we're going to try to, and folks need to understand, if they wait for Category 3 in a rapid intensification system, they waited too long. So that's a message that we're going to have to, both in the preparedness time now and the lead up time later. That's something that we know now and that we've seen, and we're going to make sure we get out ahead of that.
Again, I think it goes back to that in years past, we were just trying to get people to understand Category 1, Category 2, Category 3. I think everybody in the weather industry has done a great job of educating, especially those people in harm's way, of what these, what those category numbers mean in general. But now we may have gone too far in that they're assigning too much emphasis to those category numbers, because we saw with Florence, made landfall Category 1, but yet still had devastating results. Yeah, exactly. It's the challenge now going forward is that we've kind of raised the level to here, but now we need to take people to that next level to understand the kind of the nuances, the differences between those different impacts. And I think that's our challenge going forward. That
and the fact that inland rainfall and post-storm are when the majority of deaths have been happening in the last 10 to 12 years. So those are real focus areas for us.
Very good. And so that even applies to non-coastal National Weather Service offices, non-coastal broadcast meteorologists, because they have to be aware, because just because you're in Atlanta or you're in Birmingham, you could still see some devastating results from these the remnants of these tropical systems as they move well inland.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to stay on the topic of messaging here real quick. Can you give maybe some examples of how you dealt with the challenge of managing or addressing rumors or misleading information that from non-official sources that have come across on social media and whatnot, or just people who sort of downplay the message? How do you deal with that? Can you give some examples of experiences in your career?
From a television standpoint, of course, we see it a lot with social media, Twitter, Facebook. Everybody has access to the models. So some random person who may be just a weather enthusiast or not, who's just trying to get some followers or likes, is tweeting out those models. So from our standpoint, I think you have to, kind of going back to what I was talking about, explain the scenarios, what's most likely, but also what's the worst case scenario. And I think in this day and age with social media, it's making our job even tougher with the messaging point, because there's a lot of misinformation out there, and it spreads like wildfire even before we can even get our hands on it and see what people are talking about. Sometimes it's already made it through a lot of informational sources these days that we can't just keep track of. But I think it just comes down to explaining the scenarios in a better perspective. I showed that graphic with the Saffir-Simpson scale. I think we, as a broadcast community, we need to make maybe more comprehensive, better graphics that break down all the hazards that come with these systems, and just explain it in an easy, understanding way without being an alarmist and just being a realist, because we have to go through it with the community too.
I think one thing we tried to do with Michael was we knew we needed to be an official source. In the absence of an official source, there will be all kinds of rumor and unofficial information that will fill in. We got approval at the last minute to use Facebook Live, and we wanted to have a way to directly interact with folks in the affected areas. And I was shocked to see our overnight Facebook Live video on landfall night was, I believe, 60,000 people watching. So for an office that had never used Facebook Live before to get that kind of reach, and we heard stories of people who evacuated because of the Facebook Live video. You've got to have an official source, or things will slide in.
And I think that one of the things that I've always told forecast offices, and the same thing applies to the broadcast meteorologists, is that social media is out there. It's a fact. So you need to be out there as an official source and establishing yourself as a credible place to go to. We certainly don't want social media to be anybody's only go-to source, but we want it to be, if they hear something, we want people to be able to go and look at either a Broadcast Met's social media source or the National Weather Service office, the social media source, to get the official word. And of course, the important thing is, and I know that we all work on this, is that we're all speaking the same language, and we're sending the same message, is what I'm trying to say. So it's important to be out there on, again, it's important to be out there on these blue sky days, these clear skies days, establishing yourself as the official source, so that when the time comes that people can turn to you and they know that they can trust that you'll be there, and that they will be able to get relevant and critical information from you, from that source, and that it jibes and fits nicely with all the other sources that they're hearing. Because I think from what I'm seeing from the studies is that once people get one piece of information, they go searching for others to either downplay it or play it up, or to corroborate it. And if they turn to us, whether it's the Weather Service or the broadcast community, that's we need to be messaging the same, but we also need to be there so that we can get that message out to them. So I got a quick question for Miss Rebecca. Because we touched on. Rebecca touched on the fact that the general public dealing with rumors and things on social media. What's it like when the director of FEMA or even someone like the president says, "Well, I saw on," they're the ones that are picking up on some of these rumors or these things on social media. So how do you handle that in more of a high level official source kind of thing?
Well, I have never been asked about the Euro versus GFS by a president. However, we have had our previous FEMA administrators are very weather savvy. And so we are very well aware of that. My regional administrator and their staff are very weather savvy. So it is often that people are talking about the models and, they say it's going to do this and they say it's going to do that. And rather than fight all of that or block internet access in the EOC or turn off the Weather Channel and cut the cable cord, I work with it because they want the information. They're going to go seek it out. I would rather help guide them to the best information and explain why it's meeting their need. If they ask a question, well, what are you really trying to find out with that information? What do you really need to answer? And sometimes if they're looking at spaghetti plots, they're just looking and it's a piece of information, but we don't make $1 million life safety decisions based on one model run or even one forecast cycle. We're very measured and very much rely on the National Hurricane Center, the National Weather Service, and official sources of information. That being said, part of my job is to sort of cut through that noise because more information isn't necessarily better when it comes to decision making. So I really try to point out the key pieces of information, the best information that will help guide those decisions. But to do that, you have to have an understanding of really what the decisions that we're heading toward are.
Very good. One question that I have real quick, and you touched on it, spaghetti plots. We've also got, we get people who get too focused on the spaghetti plots and the possible range of possibilities. You also get, on the other end, you get people that get very, very focused on that forecast track. And if I'm outside that forecast track, I'm not going to have a problem, kind of thing. What are some things that, especially for broadcast meteorologists or the NWS meteorologists, what are some tools or things that we can use to kind of, like Ms. Rebecca said, kind of cut through some of that and get to the point of the matter?
Well, I would say, first of all, that we definitely emphasize that a hurricane is not a point on a map. And because, as you mentioned earlier, we don't just need a few counties in one location to prepare and make decisions based on a skinny black line. We're usually talking about entire states that need to be prepared for some sort of weather impact. And so we emphasize the hazards a lot. And we also, like I said, model spread is out there, but I always tell people, if you go back and look at the verification statistics for the National Hurricane Center, they will usually beat those models. So that's why we rely so heavily on their guidance. And also to avoid those swings, sometimes we can say, let's wait till the next advisory before we make a decision. So I try to help guide people in that direction. And sometimes helps when people are on the ledge about, oh my goodness, everything is saying this, and that. The tempo of Twitter and the tempo of broadcast meteorologists, no offense, you guys are a critical partner, but sometimes they get people very spun up that we have to do something right now.
I know one thing that I like to look at, or I like to see come across, are those graphics that sort of show the size of, say, the wind fields, and then on top of that, just the amount of rainfall that could potentially fall with the storm itself, and because the size of the storm, they could be really large storm, but perhaps not have a very broad radius of strong winds per se, but it's going to dump a lot of rain over an area, and the storm surge is very directly related to the wind field. And I don't know, I sort of feel like you've got your cone, you've got your the cone, yeah, and track, and so to speak, but I don't know. I really like to see the size of the storm as well, and that's just me personally. I'm curious if you all have found that sort of information to be helpful for decision making.
We try to steer people to the hazard, threat, and impacts, the HTI graphics, which show that rainfall threat, the wind threat, tornado threat, all the different impact threats from the hurricane. Those are available on the tropical web pages of the Southern region and the rest of the National Weather Service. That's what we try to, because it tries to capture the scope and the scale and focus on the impacts.
So, we've gone a little over on our time. So I do want to be cognizant of your guys' time and everyone who's watching this time. I guess kind of wrapping things up, what are some kind of one last bit of advice as we look forward to the 2019 hurricane season, which Dr. Bella's kind of laid out is going to be potentially average, which means definitely active. And as he pointed out, it just takes one kind of thing. So what can people do to, prepare for this season, and be ready for the potential? If you live even along the coast or even inland a little ways, what can people do to just kind of be ready for this hurricane season?
Well, when we did issued the hurricane outlook at National Press Conference in Washington, D.C., the number 2 man at FEMA was stressing flood insurance. And we don't really hear too much about that, but your regular homeowner's insurance does not cover flooding. And what we see now with so many people living inland along the coast, flooding it affects millions of people. And he gave some numbers, but if you didn't have flood insurance, you were basically screwed in some of these storms, whereas the people that did have it were essentially made whole. And it's a huge thing. A lot of people you don't really hear people talk about it, and it's really important. But from a weather perspective, how can I be pushing somebody's insurance? But it's a part of your hurricane preparedness. If you're in a hurricane area, you need to be protected.
Very good point. I don't think a lot of people, as far as their hurricane preparedness, they're thinking about having a couple days worth of water, some food to eat, but they're not thinking about, again, as Tom had mentioned earlier, what to do in the aftermath. And one of those things is to make sure that you're financially able to survive a hurricane. And I think insurance is a big part of that. Does anyone else have any kind of tips for people as we look forward to this hurricane season?
Just always be prepared ahead of time. As we mentioned, those storms spin up quickly, so get ready now. I mean, even if it's quiet for months and days, we can see a change in 24, 48 hours with something developing pretty fast. Even last year with Tropical Storm Gordon, it spun up over Labor Day weekend pretty quickly. So these things can spin up fast, so always be prepared.
Yeah, and typically during June and July in an active season, you might only see 1 or 2 named storms. The peak of the hurricane season is August, September, October. That's when by far the bulk of the hurricanes and nearly all major hurricanes form. It's not to say you can't get an early season storm that produces tropical storm, slow moving inland, produces tremendous flooding. So get ready now. You can be impacted through the season, but you have a little more time now before the peak of that season hits. Don't wait.
Miss Rebecca, Tom, do you guys have any comments?
I think, for us, we're really focusing on having, the 5 days worth of supplies. Something, if you choose to stay, make sure you've got 5 days worth of food, medicine, critical things that will allow you to survive until the cavalry arrives. It used to be 3, and really we're seeing with these major storms, 3 may not be enough.
Wow.
And pay attention to the tropical outlooks. If you live on the Florida Gulf Coast, it is well worth your time to at least once a day just check to see if anything's happening. Another one of Dr. Meyer's findings and other social scientists is this term anchoring, where someone will see something about a storm on Saturday, and that's all they need to know for the rest of the week, and things can change dramatically. So trying to get people's focus and understand human nature, that you might think that, hey, it's just a tropical storm today, I don't have to worry about it. And that is what you think for the next few days without even getting any new information. Be aware of that human tendency and try to counteract that. That's what we're challenging our team to do.
Very good. I guess as an aside, one other question I wanted to ask real quick, because I asked kind of a general question for the general public. What can the meteorologists do to be ready for this hurricane season specifically? We talked about the building those relationships in the blue sky time of the year, but what can and Tom, you even mentioned that you guys did hurricane training. You did it in April, May, but then you did it again in September. What can meteorologists in specific, whether you're in the broadcast, whether you're doing government support, whether you're in the NWS, what can they do to get themselves ready for this hurricane season?
I think we need to follow the advice that we give the public, and we did that with Michael. There was a lot of people scrambling to get supplies before Michael, but I think here we need to decide if we're going to be here, then we need to have those supplies and have a plan here at the office. But we also need to have a plan for our families. So I think that you have a place identified, a couple places identified ahead of time that you're going to evacuate to, and make sure you don't evacuate in an area that's going to be affected as well.
Very true. Very true. Let's see. Anyone else got any quick comments?
I'll say for blue sky type of weather, preparedness-wise, we're visible in the public. We're going to hurricane expos, handing out tips to viewers about how to get prepared for hurricane season. So that kind of goes back to giving yourself some credibility in the broadcast community, that you're visible in the community, you're available to the public to talk to them one-on-one outside of the TV to establish a little bit more of a relationship with them. So we've done several hurricane expos here in Central Florida over the past couple of months, which really helps build that credibility in the community and helps them turn to you when they're seeing crazy things on social media.
Ms. Rebecca, do you have any last thoughts?
Yes, I would just say, in addition to all those, which are wonderful points, and yes, flood insurance, you need 30 days usually before it can take effect. So get it early if you don't have it. And we are messaging in many cases, it's not 72 hours anymore. You need 7 days because you are the help until help arrives. In many cases, that's just the reality. But I wanted to just say that there's so many of meteorologists and emergency managers across the entire country that have really been going at it since last year, nonstop. We've seen, an incredible amount of damage and impacts in our areas, and it's really important to take care of each other and take care of yourself, and lean on each other, but also take that time off if you need it to recharge the batteries. I'm struggling with that myself, how I recharge my batteries when there is no time off for a meteorologist in the Southeast. So, but it's important. So find a way, whatever way you choose to replenish yourself.
I thought maybe it just might be just to mention some of the just basic things that you can do to prepare, just more from a list thing. If you're going to hunker down and not evacuate, you need food, water, batteries, flashlights, your medications to last 5-7 days. You may be without power even longer than that. You may not have access if you're in a flood area to anything outside. If you're in an evacuation zone, you need to have in like a waterproof type of container or something, your medications, things for kids and pets. Cash, ATMs don't work without power. Important documents, your identity, the proof that you own your home, things like that. Change of clothing, hygiene items. Just use common sense and think about, all right, if I need to be gone for several days, what am I going to need? Now is the time to do that when you're calm and can think, rather than at the last second the storm is hunkering down and you're in total panic mode. That's not the time to do this. The time is now. And like I mentioned, the websites, FEMA.gov and hurricanes.gov, they list things like this and give a lot of information. So it definitely behooves you to take some time and prepare.
Very good. My co-host, Miss Rebecca, do you have any final thoughts?
I just want to thank everybody for participating in this webinar. You've all given extremely thoughtful and great advice for both meteorologists and forecasters and the general public, how to prepare for these big monster storms. It's inevitable that we're going to see this happen again. And it really, like Jerry says, it only takes one storm to cause major havoc wherever it makes landfall, whether it be this, southeast or even we had a hurricane or a tropical cyclone approach England this past year. It only takes one. So prepare now. And I appreciate everybody coming onto this webinar and giving their expertise to our viewers. So thank you.
Very good. Well, I want to kind of wrap things up. I want to thank Tom Johnson, the MIC from Tallahassee, for joining us, Chris Gilson from Spectrum News, joining us, giving us the broadcaster perspective, Rebecca Moulton from FEMA Region 4, and of course, Dr. Jerry Bell giving us that great outlook and those tips. So I really thank you all for joining us. Thank my co-host, Rebecca Mazer, up there in Alaska. I did want to remind everyone, I want to thank everyone for joining us on YouTube, but I did want to remind everyone that the NWA does these webinars once a month, and next month in July, I believe it's going to be on July 10th, and we're basically going to talk about some of the benefits that students can get from going to the NWA annual meeting. So especially if you're a student, but even if you're not, we talked I think it was our last webinar where we talked about mentoring and helping out. If you're a mentor or you have a senior position, this would also be a good webinar for you guys to watch so that you can pass that information on to the younger generation, so to speak, of the meteorologists, just the benefits of going to these annual meetings and what they can do to help move your career along. So without further ado, as they say, I want to wrap today's up. I want to thank again everybody on the panel. I want to thank you for joining us. And like we said, if you live along the coast, it'd be a good idea to just once a day or once every other day to check that tropical discussion and just keep an eye on the tropics, because like we've seen, they can spin up very quickly. So I appreciate everyone's time today, and everyone just keep one eye on the weather and stay safe. All right. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks. Bye-bye.